The SPP will affect the food we eat, the air we breathe, and the human rights and civil liberties we enjoy. It will give an illegitimate corporate proxy to corporations by allowing corporate power to supplant the democratic authority of the people. Canadian democracy and democratic values are under attack with the SPP. Canadians are facing the greatest crisis since Confederation. Now you might say, well, we went through 2 world wars. How can that be? When we fought those world wars, we were united as a nation. We knew what the objective was, and we knew what the enemy was, outside our borders. Now the enemy is within our borders and hidden. It's out of view. There's a silent corporate coup d'etat going on. How did we get here? If we examine a little bit of how we got here, maybe we can look at other ways to get out, including, of course, traditional democratic parliamentary processes. But is that enough in this situation? No. Well, let's examine the last 35 years. Trudeau was PM for a total of 15 years and 5 months. He was later hired by the Power Corporation of Canada, as was his assistant Ted Johnson and his clerk of the Privy Council, that's the deputy PM, who actually, that was Pitfield, who actually became the vice chair of Power Corporation. Trudeau commissioned the Royal Commission on the Economic Union and Development Prospects of Canada, the MacDonald Commission, which led to the FTA. Now, they didn't survive for that commission to come to fruition. The Mulroney government, which, when they won the election from the Liberals, said we would not support that kind of agreement, the MacDonald Commission came through and said we should have it, while Mulroney got on board and said, yeah, we'll support it. He was PM for 8 years, 9 months. He signed on to the FTA and tried to import it, tried to use it immediately, and there was a hue and cry. Do you remember that back in 88, 89? What had happened just previous to that was the federal courts had decided that third parties could contribute money, unlimited amounts of money, to political issues around election times. And the Business Council on National Issues, which has been referred to now as the Canadian Council of Chief Executives, which they are called now, dumped millions of dollars into that election in 1989. And they just overwhelmed the public interest and knowledge on this subject. And even though there was a majority opposed to the FTA, the Mulroney government won the election and installed the FTA. Well, right away, the Chrétien government said, hey, if we got elected in the next election, we'd kick the FTA out. Chrétien was PM for 10 years. He said he would kick out the FTA. He nibbled around the edges on it. Guess what? He signed NAFTA. He was president of the Treasury Board in 1974 at a time when Canada's national debt was seen to have its exponential rise. Now we have massive debt. What is it, $600 billion? He worked for the Power Corporation of Canada in 1986. His chief of staff, Eddie Goldenberg, also worked for the Power Corporation. Chrétien's daughter married Power Corporation's son, Andrew. Paul Martin was PM for 2 years and 1 month. He signed the SPP. Well, that's great. He worked for Power Corporation of Canada in the 60s, and he purchased Canadian steamship lines from them, which has been his and his family's source of wealth. Now, Mr. Harper, Premier Harper, Prime Minister Harper, he was a young Liberal club member in university. But when Trudeau brought in the National Energy Program, he switched. He went conservative. He went conservative after Trudeau brought in the National Energy Program. The reason I bring up Power Corporation is because they're a major player in the Canadian Council of Chief Executives. They're the most represented group of all the 150 groups in the Canadian Council of Chief Executives. And they have major investments in the American private healthcare system. Billions. In their last fiscal year, they purchased an entire hospital. They're experimenting. Hired all the staff. Now they're the employer of the entire several thousand member hospital. They're in this process because they're in insurance. That's where the money is. Now, I don't know if you've seen the movie Sicko, which is which is now moving up ahead to be the most popular documentary of all time in the United States. Well, I wonder why. The greatest cause of personal bankruptcy in the United States is medical bills. There was a transcript on Amy Goodman's Democracy Now! Website where she was interviewed in Sicko, and she said that a doctor denied a patient medical care that she felt, was probably necessary, and that patient died, and she received benefits from the insurance company. So what we've got happening here is something that transcends by far the democratic processes we're familiar with. We can't use the normal tools we've used in the past, and time is wasting. Look at this Harper government. They're moving now to go to a 2009 finish date for the election. This is a minority government. When was the last time we had a minority government go to term, full term? And look what we've got on the table, SPP. How did this happen? This is a grave error in our system. When we've already heard about corporate control of the media and media concentration in this country, we have the greatest level of media concentration in the developed world, more than the States. How do we get the message out? Well, if you look at a little bit of that history of NAFTA and where we're in here with British Columbia and the Trade, Investment, and Labor Mobility Agreement, well, it's interesting that when NAFTA came out and was signed by the Liberal government, Chrétien government, they actually didn't have the authority to enforce NAFTA. It's beyond their constitutional jurisdiction. It was treading on ground that was actually in the domain of the provinces. NAFTA came out in January 1st, 1994. That's the same year that the Agreement on Internal Trade was signed in Canada. 1994. So they were developing this Agreement on Internal Trade, saying that it was to reduce trade barriers amongst the provinces, when really it was because they needed some mechanism to force the provinces so they could adhere to NAFTA. And here's a part of NAFTA that they had to adhere to. It's Article 105 called the Extent of Obligations. It says, the parties shall ensure that all necessary measures are taken in order to give effect to the provision of this agreement, including their observance, except as otherwise provided in this agreement, by state and provincial governments. The AIT put forward as an agreement to reduce trade barriers amongst the provinces was actually to force compliance so that we could get on board with NAFTA. Well, in the AIT, Article 1800 allowed the provinces to form agreements amongst themselves. Well, this is interesting because that's the jurisdiction of the federal government. That's curious. What did the provinces come up with? BC and Alberta, well, we've heard of it. It's called TILMA, Trade, Investment, and Labor Mobility. Any regulation, any standard, any law, any procedure, any policy that impairs or restricts trade, investment, or labor mobility can be challenged to the adjudication panels, and persons or corporations can receive up to a $5 million award if they're found to be those regulations were violating their right for a profit. Well, what regulation does not impact a right for a profit? That's why we have regulations, standards. And that's why Canada is such a popular place in the world to live. It's our standard of living, our quality of life.